Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first virtual lecture on YouTube. I'm Diane from the Godrej India Culture Lab. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the lab is an experimental cultural space that encourages dialogue through innovative programming. In a pre-COVID world, these dialogues would take shape as large public events that would take place in our campus in Victoria. And since then, we've made our programming go digital until we resume into our physical world. For the past few months, we've come to you with a range of lectures. Some of them have been on Instagram. We've done a couple of chats called What Matters series that you can go to our Instagram handle and check out. And also, I would urge you all to check out the meme project. A big shout out to the leadership batch of 2020. The meme project was their capstone project. It's a digital project that you can go check out on memeprojectindia.com. And it has a range of things that you can check out, from podcasts to a memeolution to a bunch of interesting videos and blogs. Now I'll get back to the event at hand. We've all been waiting for this very incredible lecture called The Green Beat with Sonali Prasad. Before I formally introduce Sonali to you, shout out to our friends at the India Climate Collaborative. Shloka, Anurati and team, thank you so much for supporting this and amplifying the message. We really are happy to have you on board. For all of you all joining us through ICC, welcome. And now for the main person we've all been waiting for. A freshly minted Knight Science Journalism Fellow from MIT, Sonali Prasad is a climate and environment reporter, and her stories have taken different forms, from print, video, data to art and installations. She's been an investigative reporter at Columbia University's Energy and Environment Project, and her work has been published in the Washington Post, The Guardian, to just name a few. She's a former Google News Lab Fellow and a Pulsar Traveling Fellow. In her talk today, Sonali will draw from lessons she's learned about immersive storytelling, intersectional environmentalism, and conservation. If you have any questions for Sonali, please do leave your comments and your questions in the chat window that you see live on the right of your screen. If you're joining us from Twitter and Instagram, please use the hashtag #TheGreenBeat for any tweets that you're making about the event. And you can even send us your questions via Instagram and Twitter using the same hashtag. Our team will make sure we get them to Sonali, and we'll try our best to answer them during the Q&A session. Further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to request Sonali to join me here. Sonali, if you can please turn on your video and your camera and come join us on this chat.
Hi, Diane. Can you see
me?
Hi,
Sonali. Yes, I can.
And how are you? Hear me clear? I'm good. Yes. How are you?
Very, very good. Okay, I'm going to sign off.
Thank you for your kind words. Sure.
Of course. I'm going to sign off. It's over to you.
Thank you. Let me begin by saying that I'm extremely happy to be here, and I well in such challenging times, and we're all finding our little islands of hope to get by. I'm going to begin with a story, a small story. One early morning, just a few days ago, in the enforced stillness of this pandemic, as a meditative exercise, I watched rivers of red-hot lava flow. A sped-up video of the Hawaiian volcano Kilauea erupting and gobbling up homes and roads, disassembling the world around it. Then a separate photograph of navigating the black landscape once the lava had cooled down, trying to find her home on the new land. When she had found where her property could be or could have been, she began planting coconut trees. It suddenly dawned on me, isn't this much of what has been happening around the world? Movements, eruption, lava spewing, lava that will eventually cool down to form new island. But when this ground forms, even as the eruption continues, Having consumed our bunkers and our no sense of the world, how will we explore it differently? Where will we put up our trees, our tents, and houses? As a storyteller, I'm taking this time to try and find the answer to this not so simple question when it comes to narratives around climate change and environmental crisis. And it is what I want to talk to you about today. Let me share my screen quickly. So there's a term being widely discussed currently, intersectional environmentalism. With 2020 going down in the history books as the year we couldn't breathe for many reasons, systemic violence, pollution, the coronavirus, activist Leah Thomas observed the intersection of these factors, the links between social and environmental injustices occurring in oppressed communities, and popularized the term intersectional environmentalism, a movement that advocates for both the protection of the people and the planet. We cannot talk about environmental justice without realizing that the same vulnerable communities face much structural neglect and discrimination. It is no coincidence. People disproportionately affected by extreme heat in India or bad water or natural disasters are more or less the same set of forgotten poor who have fallen through the crack in the country's lockdown. Some walking for hundreds of kilometers back to their villages without much food or shelter, even after shooting out the afterbirth on the side of the road. Some dying on their way home on trains, the invisible made visible in the grand exodus from cities. Climate and environmental issues will only exacerbate the pandemonium of our times. Here's an example of this intersection. Chhattisgarh in central India is known for its coal deposits, and many inhabitants of the state are Adivasis, India's indigenous population, also our poorest lot. This is a fragment of a Supreme Court judgment from 2011, so what seems like many moons ago, talking about the human tragedy unfolding due to predatory forms of capitalism, supported and promoted by the state and rooted around extractive industries in Chhattisgarh. Just the burning clarity of the judgment made it worth sharing. The justices were reminded of the novella Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, who perceived darkness at 3 levels, and I would like to quote the third one. The darkness represented by inhumanity and evil to which individual human beings are capable of descending when supreme and unaccounted force is vested, rationalized by a warped worldview that parades itself as pragmatic and inevitable in each individual level of command. The horror, the horror. So what is environmental crisis in such places? It is gross violation of human rights. It's insurgency, poor air quality, displacement, extortion, abandonment, killings. It is missing people, girls married young, women being sexually assaulted. It is many knees on many necks. There's a pressing need to explore such interlinked issues by constructing more inclusive and comprehensive realities in our stories. Because the absence of these considerations weakens any argument against the superstructures exercising social and psychological control over the communities. We must remember that today, how we tell a story is equally as important as what we tell in the story. How we tell is a political act, not a mindless one. There are many things we can do to lend to more sustainable narratives, and I've tried breaking them into 10 doable acts or starting points. Keeping them in mind, I'll also be looking at the gaps I can fill in my storytelling if I had to do the same project's pieces together. let us look at diving into a colonial past. This is a quote by Mary Hegler, who writes on climate justice issues. It's no accident that the map of climate change's worst wraths to date looks like a colonizer's playground, because that's what it is. If we trace back the history of environmental injustices in India, you will stumble upon their colonial legacies. The powers who built their empires on fossil fuels, who decided that the land was theirs to plunder and the natural resources were to be used in the service of the Raj, or the state. We can still see that colonial hangover in our policy making. And thus, it is important to write about the historical context so that we can decolonize our knowledge and solutions going forward. I'll give you two examples of this. The first one, let us look at India's forest cover target of 33%. Where did this number come from, this 33%? Researchers from the University of California, Davis, and University of Wisconsin-Madison found out in a study that there is no sound science as of now to back this target, but there is colonial history. The target was primarily developed by the Europeans, mainly France, as the ideal amount of territory to be covered by wooded land, and then it spread to British and French colonial territories in Africa and parts of the world, including Asia. Also, we must look at the whole inherited concept of forestry, which champions afforestation schemes to meet this target of 33% and is based on the idea of mass plantations. But what is the impact of these schemes on local communities that are dependent on for their livelihoods? What about community control of the land? Can we have this discussion in a silo without talking about rampant deforestation? We should design our line of investigation in such a format while looking at environment policies in India. This is again a small anecdote I found while researching about a past disaster. It speaks of how colonialism has affected our imagination when it comes to certain regions and communities. These are photos of the Great Assam earthquake, an 8.6 magnitude earthquake that occurred on 15th August 1950, 3 years after independence. It was brutal and caused massive devastation. When Prime Minister Nehru had to make a plea for help to his countrymen, he made a pedagogical introduction to the region. This is what he said in his All India radio speech. Look at the map of India. You will find Assam on the northeastern corner, bordering Tibet and China and Burma and Pakistan. He did this because the northeast frontier did not vividly capture the interest of the mainland. And this was in many ways because of the fact that the region had been among the last to be conquered by the British Raj, which had occurred only in a very piecemeal and rudimentary fashion. The earthquake and the subsequent relief measures did end up carving out a space for the region on Indian mental maps. But somehow this attitude of disinterest towards the Northeast has trickled down to even today, when it is treated much like an ignored child of the country. We want its resources, but not its problem. Its truths are very different from the realities of, say, states like Uttar Pradesh or Bihar. One thing we can do in this regard, and generally to serve the purpose of inclusive storytelling, is to make space for local storytellers, voices and researchers from different backgrounds who know the pulse of the ground, the communities, the vocabulary, the hidden realities of an issue, the power dynamics, and so amplifying their perspectives is important. I'll tell you how we can do this in the smallest way. These photos are from some of the stories I did under the long-term project Ranger that documented the lives and tribulations of forest frontline staff across national parks in India. Now, for each leg of travel for the Ranger project, Mukha, the creative collective that I partnered with, helped me search for visual storytellers local from the area, well as local as we could get. So instead of working with someone from Delhi to cover the northeast stretch in one leg, that's Kaziranga in Assam, Pake Reserve in Arunachal Pradesh, and in Tanki in Nagaland. We went with Indrajit Rajkhova, who's from Assam, who reached out to us when we put up a call. He created a very different and effective visual identity with his own understanding of the parks, using his style of environmental portraiture for these pieces, very distinct from the other legs of the project. He also was a useful bridge as a translator in many scenarios. Here on the screen, you can see two images. The left one is from Nagaland, and the story revolved around the wildlife trafficking of the tokay gecko, which is a lizard of the lesser god, one of the largest living species of gecko in the world. And on the right is an image from Pake Reserve in Arunachal Pradesh, and the story was about community-based efforts to save hornbill species around the park. This is a photograph of one of the floating anti-poaching teams protecting rhinos at Kaziranga in Assam. But if I could do this entire project again today, aside from doing more stories based in the South, I would try to really work on including more local visual storytellers with adequate resources available across all legs of the project. It is never ideal to clump states together as one region. And when it comes to the writing for this series, I would simply start with making changes to my source list. So a vast majority of conservationists, biologists, experts quoted in the stories across all 6 national parks were male. And it's not as if there's a dearth of women experts in the conservation space who can tell you about the current situation in the field or even future ecologies. So then why was there such a big gap? Why was there a vast majority of male experts in my sources? So the one thing I've started to do now to bridge that gap is to slowly coax my male experts, the sources, to recommend their female colleagues, because there needs to be a sensitization on both sides. Even sources interviewed from villages living within and around national parks or involved in community conservation efforts were mostly male in my stories. Aside from one profile of a female guard in Desert National Park, Rajasthan, which was our first story, we could have built more storytelling around women guards, rangers. So again, when you're sourcing for a story, try to not only look across gender, but across ethnicities, caste, class, background, to represent different experiences. In regards to the Northeast specifically, I would like to highlight 2 projects working in this direction, and hopefully the team can put up the links in the YouTube chat. Green Hub, which empowers local youth in the conservation space by training them in the visual medium. And second is Northeast Lightbox on Instagram, a feed of photography coming in from the region. Also, to amplify the journalism that's coming in from the Northeast, which was especially incredible when it came to the ground reporting of the gas well fire in Bagjan, Assam, I've created a Twitter list of local reporters, so do follow them. We start by reading and reacting to their stories to get more attention to the Northeast. Next, making climate change an Asian issue. And I have a very interesting story to tell. When I was doing my fellowship in Cambridge, I saw a poster for a climate grief support group. And I was very curious because coming from India, the idea was very alien to me. So basically, it was a forum where people gathered and talked about their climate anxieties, projections and data models of how New York's going to get flooded, how stories can be crafted to bring issues like plastic pollution that are unfolding in different parts of the world home. But I felt strange and disconnected because for me, climate change and environmental degradation is not an issue in the near future or happening someplace else. It is here and brutally unfolding in Asia. Look at the powerful cyclone Amphan that slammed into India and Bangladesh in the midst of a pandemic. Look at the extreme heat, the locust invasion. Here, everyday catastrophes have become a numb man's guessing game. But all this was not central to their discourse. And that is when I realized the narrative scarcity. We have to make Asia a central character in climate change storytelling, away from Western subjectivity. We cannot be parading in the backdrop hopelessly, adding to the chorus. We will have to develop our own language to meet our needs. There has to be a sense of urgency, a sense that you're looking at grotesque realities past the tipping point in our stories. And where do we start? If you have an international audience or even a national audience, stop for a moment to think why Cyclone Amphan didn't get its due coverage. How much screen time did it get? Disasters? How much pressure do we put on our politicians to face this reality? We have to push for such narratives. Make this the issue you go batting for. You can't do away with projections and data, but in my opinion, what needs to be prioritized is the reality of what's unfolding currently in this part of the world. The next point is very important and intricate and goes back to the Chhattisgarh example. How do we effectively cover social and environmental issues pertaining to our most vulnerable population, our tribal communities? And these are the stories where I think more and more about every step that I take because it's so easy to falter. We must know our place when we tell the stories. Sometimes it's outsiders, even if you're Indian and you're going somewhere in some other state to cover these stories. Our gaze tends to be exploitative, and we have to check that. Wherever possible, and this is something I'm working on, pair up with someone working with the community or from the community to do the story. Try exploring new protocols of acknowledgement. If they are collaborating with you and doing all the heavy lifting, doing all the production work, then there has to be a word beyond fixer. Talk to your editors about this. There's a trust building exercise that I carried in both these stories that needs to take place with the communities. We just cannot drop in and expect them to expose their woes when they're so used to hollow promises. I will briefly mention two stories. So on the left is a story about a seed revival movement carried out in Singrauli Industrial Cluster in Madhya Pradesh, where an ash dike breached earlier in April. While look into traditional knowledge and self-sufficient ways to battle climate distress and food insecurity, the Sasan story was about pollution, the health crisis, safety violations, foreign investments, displacement, and silencing of the vulnerable groups carried out by industry giants. So what could be done differently today? In the Dongria Kon story, which was about self-sufficiency, traditional rituals, and empowerment, there was a mention of the mining project that was rejected by the tribe in 2013 when the Supreme Court observed that for mining clearance, their consent would have to be taken. But because of that win and many other factors, the tribe is considered to be a roadblock to development and assimilation by the state government. And that prevalent layer of tension is something I would build upon more thickly today. Say, for example, the disagreement regarding building wide roads into the forested hills. It is important to do so because the story is not complete without it. And in the second story, there's something so fundamental that I would do differently today. The health issues are described, the land disputes, the safety issues, but there is no clear mention of the rights of the Bega tribals who were exiled from their jungle for the Sasan Power Project. The story cannot be done without filling that hole today. Also, I'd place much more emphasis on the issue of human rights violations, migrant labor going missing in that region, because I knew that it was happening. Many of my sources who spoke to me didn't want to be named because they feared mistreatment, but that aspect did not occupy much space in the article. Also, at this point, I should say that it is very important to realize that not every tribal group is the same, so we should avoid using broad brushstrokes while covering vulnerable communities, tribal communities. Another way of inclusive storytelling is community participation. This segues into my bigger, broader international projects. What is a decentralized story? It is a story where you enable the community with the toolkit necessary, and then they pave out and disseminate the narrative. So there's no single source broadcasting information to a big audience, but there's small sources doing the dissemination. We attempted this through our sensor-based project, Reef Source, and this is where one of my major areas of interest lies, immersive storytelling. This was an international team effort. There was 3 engineers from Stanford and 3 reporters, data journalists from Columbia. And we got funds for a full year to find a way to deduce coral reef health metrics by studying fluorescence data from underwater images. So basically what we did is build a technology pipeline, and then we gave the GoPros to the local diving groups that were already recreationally diving near the reef spots. They submitted the images, the underwater images that they took of the reefs to our portal, and we did the analysis to come up with the observations. The groups then used this project to engage in their own local storytelling initiatives. One of the volunteering groups was the Southwest Florida Women's Dive Club, and their goal was to foster community building through ocean conservation efforts. They did a Women's Day dive, which was amazing, so that's the crew on the right. Their movement was as much about sharing collective joy as it was about voicing joint concerns about the local reef. They were able to tell their own stories and even went on a local TV channel to speak about the project. The one thing I do differently today would be to make much more of a cohesive effort to collect all these community stories on a common platform. Next, the autopsy of a disaster. This is known in the journalism community, but there must be a focus on follow-up stories when it comes to climate or environmental impact in communities, because the misery does not end when a news cycle does, especially when it comes to natural disasters, such as a big tsunami or the recent cyclone Amphan. It is important to conduct an autopsy, as sociologist Eric Kleinenberg says, to open up the body, to examine the social, political, and institutional organs that may have contributed to or exacerbated the disaster. We must also investigate the aftermath, look at the breakdown in social order, see what lessons were learned, what infrastructure or early warning systems were developed, what was the socioeconomic impact of the disaster, how was national or international funding used. Delving into past calamities can help us identify patterns for the current times and the future. For example, if we want to explore or understand the breakdown of social order after a disaster, we can look at the Kanto earthquake in Japan in 1923. Days after the earthquake, thousands of Korean residents were killed because the word went around that they were going to try and take advantage of the disaster by looting and committing arson. A similar thing happened after Hurricane Katrina. A white man who was sentenced to 10 years for shooting black men after the disaster reportedly told his neighbor that he will shoot anything darker than a brown paper bag walking up the street. So you see the patterns repeating, how we look for someone to blame the disruption on, a particular group specifically. Now let's look at the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which caused devastation across several countries, including India. I went to Aceh in Indonesia, which was ground zero of the disasters 15 years ago, and saw the gaping flaws caused due to short-term planning. Aid agencies built houses, but many of them today are abandoned because livelihood wasn't planned for. The houses were built in localities not favorable to the communities. What does the coin term, build back better, which is so commonly used when you look at disaster recovery plans today, what does it mean when you talk about disaster recovery? What happens if, like in the case of Aceh, there's a 30-year-long conflict, armed conflict, raging prior to the disaster? What about disaster preparedness? Is that not a key focus in these recovery outlines? There were schools, again, in high-risk tsunami zones when I visited, and when I asked them about their disaster preparedness drills, it was a resounding no, they didn't have any. the schools that had them, well, it was very rudimentary. After the disaster, international agencies also built a network of 22 buoys connected to seafloor sensors to transmit advance warnings. In 2016, an earthquake in Western Indonesia near Aceh revealed that none of the buoys worked anymore. Vandals had disabled some, others had fallen into disrepair, neglected because of lack of money for maintenance. This is a photo of a tsunami evacuation building in Aceh. Since 2004, there have at least been 4 tsunamis in Indonesia that resulted in the loss of life and property. Many more earthquakes have occurred in the region. Tsunamis in Palu and Sunda Strait alone claimed more than 2,400 lives, a number that might have been much lower had the early warning systems been in working condition. So these stories must be told, and this should also be a prerogative of the editors and newsrooms. I can tell you one easy way to pitch a follow-up story. Look at dates, look at anniversaries, so 15-year anniversary, 20-year anniversary, and look at comparisons between past and present disasters. Number 9, look at building multimedia projects. Use all the tools in your arsenal to tell the story of climate crisis to an evolving audience with different consumption patterns. On the left, these are 2 experiments that I have. On the left is an exhibit I put up in Harvard with my fellow colleague, Godrej, to shed light on the issue of the human toll of climate change. We used the blood falls as an imagery, which is actually an iron oxide tainted plume of salt water flowing from the tongue of Taylor Glacier in Antarctica. So if you Google blood falls, you'll actually just see a glacier bleeding. Our block of ice also resembled the language of slaughterhouses. So we mounted it with red pigment on the bottom, and the viewers could gather around it, watch it, and hear, very importantly, hear the sound of the pigment dripping, creating a sense of dread. On the right is another creative project that I'm working on, and it is a community-based project, so you all can contribute and contact me if you are interested, to create a collective memory space and intimate language that commemorates a time and landscape lost. It loosely stems from the term solastalgia, a sense of homesickness, erosion you feel while at home because of loss of landscape and seasons. So basically it's an exercise where people rummage through their family photo albums, take out a memory of, say, their parents when they were young in a natural setting and describe that memory to me. Number 10, formulate and look at long-term projects across different formats that capture the story of climate change and environmental degradation. This is important to capture the slow burn stories, the stories that unravel in chapters and not in an instant. I'll give you 2 examples here. There's a Vedatam project where my friend Siddharth Agarwal, the one you see on screen, and his team walk for kilometers along our rivers, documenting anecdotes and experiences of communities as they change with the course of the river. A great way of doing slow journalism. And the other one is a multi-generational documentary series called Baseline, a project by John Sutter, which revisits 4 communities on the front lines of the climate crisis every 5 years until 2050. The project is based on the concept of shifting baseline syndrome, hence the name Baseline 2050, which refers to a phenomenon of lowered expectations in which each generation regards a progressively poorer natural world as normal. So these were just some areas where I know we all need work as storytellers, but it starts with the conversation and taking responsibility and accountability. We must understand the need to explore intersections, unlearn and relearn the craft and nuances of storytelling to become better tellers of story, not owners of them. We must move past our arrogance. Just like they said, when this COVID thing broke out, to ensure everyone's safety, we must all assume that we are asymptomatic carriers of the disease. Same way, we have to believe that we are part of the problem. The ignorance, the inadequacies of language, the underrepresentation, the spread of misinformation when it comes to climate and environmental narratives. That our noise, our mendacity is what caused the storm in the first place. Only then do we have a chance to sail through. Thank you. And I think I'm going to close the slide share and I'm open to any questions.
Thank you so much, Sonali. Thank you so much for that. I was absolutely mesmerized. I love the way you looked back at all your years of experience and you encapsulated such powerful lessons. And just thank you so much. I was just glued to the screen for the last 30 minutes. Thank you very much. Dear viewers, we're now opening it up for Q&A. Sonali, just so that you know, there's already been a stream of messages and questions coming in. So we've already gotten some, and I'll get to them in a minute. For those of you who are just joining us, the chat comment on our live stream is up. So if you have any questions, please place them there, and my team will try our best to get them. Let me open with our first question, Sonali. You can hear me well, right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. The first question is by our viewer Mona Ambegaonkar, and she asks, telling a story correctly is important. Essential after the story is told.
So thank you, Mona, for that question. This is something that we struggle with as storytellers, the idea of impact of a story. And there are days when, I've been very restless after doing a story and it's done well on social media, but you're so desperate to see actual change, actual impact that's happening. This is something that one of my mentors has told me, that you keep chipping at the stone. There will be a time when there will be one story that makes an impact. Your job is to tell the story. And in today's time, I could say that, say, for example, the Sarsen story, there has been a breach in the ash dike recently in April. So I did that story way back in 2016. And I could bring up all that information, all the data that I excavated around money and where did the money come from and all the regulations that they were blatantly flouting. And I could join that with the current, the dike breach and make a very relevant case. Because right now, when the thing breached, people lost their lives. People were missing. So we have to continue chipping at the stone. We have to continue telling the same stories again and again to make a difference. Because unfortunately, we are living in a time where all of us have only partial concentration. We want to raise our hands in all fights, in all struggles. And so, the idea of impact thins down when there is no specificity to it. We just have to continue doing it again and again.
I think that's beautifully said. And I think that's something that even us at the lab, when we look at issues, you keep thinking, talking about the issue good enough, or do you do more? But I guess you just need to do what you can do. And we hope that on some level lays to a pass it forward. So thank you so much for that. I'll move on to our next question. We have one by Urvi Bhaumik. Could you please explicate the relationship, if any, between migration and the environment, effects and aspects particularly related to women? I think you touched upon both of these issues in your talk while you were going through your various points, but it might be a good time to go over them maybe a little bit.
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I think in this year and the year coming, we will be seeing migration related to climate change, happening in the forefront of news. And what's important to understand when you're talking about migration is that the women will get disproportionately affected. It's already happening. If you look at Bangladesh, and when there's flooding and you can see an influx of people coming into India, and instead of having a conversation around it, we just want to wrap it under the carpet. And this has been happening for years. But the influx has already been happening, and that's the reason why certain states are complaining about a dilution in their ethnicities, because people are migrating because of floods. Bangladesh is losing a lot of land, so it's not something in the future. I'd say it would become more prominent, but it's already happening, and we do need to look at our women. The first thing that happens when somebody loses a home is that it falls, and everybody is jobless and everybody can't make money. Is how does the woman make money? She will, find any number of ways to do so. And so, when you look at Bangladesh, there will be a spike in, say, sex trafficking. People will come across the border and do that. There'll be early marriages, there'll be child marriages. For example, even in this COVID lockdown, when so many people have lost their jobs and families can't support themselves, and they look at an 18-year-old girl or a 16-year-old girl who was in school, some idea of a school, and now has no school because there is no physical learning, and she doesn't have a phone to do classes on. The idea would be to, okay, she's big enough, she's old enough, she can be married off to be somebody else's concern. So the women are always at the center point of climate change, and also disasters. If you look at the Indian Ocean tsunami, when I was in Aceh, there were villages of widowers. There were villages and villages of people who had lost their wives and had remarried again. And I always wondered, why did they lose women more disproportionately? It's because most of the men were either working, so they had a time to escape. So if they were fishermen, they could run up the hills, or if they were inside. But the women were at home. And so, and when you're at home and you have to escape, your first thought is to, oh, let's take care of the family. And then, the attire, if you have a sari on and there's a tsunami coming, it doesn't help. So there are so many aspects that play into why women get disproportionately affected, even when it comes to natural disasters. And we must shed light on that, because this is something we don't talk about enough. I also find out, and I'm going to be really quick about this, that this is something people know in coastal communities, is that a lot of women didn't know how to swim. So when the tsunami hit, the men knew because they were fishermen. But despite staying so close to the ocean, despite staying at a place that is used to tsunami alerts, the women don't know how to swim. And so whenever there's going to be a tsunami, whenever there's going to be flooding, it's the women who will go down underwater. And it can be cultural, there can be cultural issues, but the whole mindset that the ocean doesn't belong to them, or they do not have the same resources to, combat climate distress in their communities, is the reason why they get disproportionately affected. So we really do have to cover that aspect in our storytelling when it comes to climate migration or disasters.
So well said, and it's coming, right? Like just now when you were telling me about how women next to in a fishing community so close. It's really alarming just generally, and that's why I remember when we first reached out to you and we started our conversation about what this conversation is going to be about, that word intersectional environmentalism, right? That it's not just about the environment, it's about these various connections and how they affect different people on so many levels, and it's all intricately connected. So thank you so much for that response. Sonali, I'm going to move to our next one, and that's actually something from the lab team that we'd like to ask you. For the rest of you, while I ask this question, if you have one, please leave it in the comment section, and my team will try their best to get it to you. Sonali, this is from my team itself, and we asked you that journalists reporting on the environment face increased dangers and censorship today, and you touched upon that briefly in your talk as well. In this scenario, how do you pitch stories about the environment, the communities impacted by climate change, to the publishers? How do you have that conversation?
Yeah. And this is a very relevant question, especially today when we have a lot of factors that make our craft endangered in a way. We have censorship, and we also, a lot of our colleagues are losing their jobs because of the economic fallout. But at the same time, this period is so historic in a lot of ways. We're telling the greatest story of our times when it comes to climate change. So I choose to think that journalism plays a very crucial role in how we would tell the story past the tipping point and before it. I think one thing you can do, you should know your editor's prejudices, number one, when you're working in a newsroom, or if you're an independent researcher, reporter like me, when you're writing to an editor, or you're writing to someone senior in your newsroom, you should already have an inkling or have a conversation about their idea of objectivity, of important reporting. How comfortable are they with the whole idea of how do you tell a story? And then you should push back. I do not think that you should, you should choose your battle. At some point, you will have to make compromises. But if it's something that is so important to you, for example, if you're writing a story about a polluting power plant, or if you're writing a story about how garment workers are mistreated, and you have to name the perpetrators. A lot of newsroom editors will not be comfortable with it, but you will have to then, push back and say this is important. Even when you're doing a story and the editors might be like, oh, this voice is not important. We have 4 people in the story, but this particular voice is not important. But you know that that person may belong to a different ethnicity, caste, class, gender. It could be an indigenous voice to an otherwise non-indigenous story. And you know that's important. So you need to really push back. And this is not easy when you start, but once you get into the game, once you've done reporting for a while, I think the people you work for, you write for, understand that, where do you come from? What is the basis of your reporting? Because the idea of objectivity in a reporting is so diluted. As I said, how we tell a story is a political act. So what is objective about it? You are telling a story, you're choosing an angle, you're going to a particular set of people to form the interviews. So you clearly are formulating that article. So where is this whole notion of objectivity? And again, this is something much like how injustices have history. The mindset of editors and newsrooms and news houses, they've also inherited this really antiquated idea of what should work as a story, and it is our duty to push back as much as we can with our work, but at the same time have a conversation. You don't have to be supremely aggressive about it. I know that when I did the Hakai story, I can tell you it took a year for me to do that disaster story. 1 year to do that article, from reporting to the actual publishing of that piece. And I must have gone around 6 or 7 edits with my editor. And she was kind enough to tell me that she's going to remove these points and then ask me which ones I am not ready to compromise on. And we had that dialogue. So you have to have that conversation. Don't be afraid of, talking about, certain things that are important to me. Don't be afraid of conflict, because then only you will move the needle. If nobody checks your editor, then there is no going forward. And if your editors or your news houses are really, really biased, like you can tell that there is a bias, in-house, I would say try as hard as you can to, work around it or to work through it by having a conversation. And one way you could do is like designing the framework around the story. For example, my editor was not biased in such a case, but for The Guardian, when we were doing the Sasan story, it possibly would have not gotten the international exposure had it just been the Sasan piece, because at that time there were no major breaches or major, people dying. So what we did was we built the framework around, oh, there is money coming in from the West, the same West that's harping upon, oh, let's close coal plants because of climate change. And they're closing coal plants in their own country, but then they're financing dirty coal plants in India. And so the contradiction is what let me do the Sasan story and for The Guardian. So you have to, build a framework that will, work for your editor and for the audience that you're writing for. I hope
Thank
that
you.
answered.
Yeah, of course. I think it was very well put out, and it is something that is so real to kind of address. And I think what you said over there, that you have to have a dialogue. I think there in that self is something that a lot of us really need to kind of focus on today, with such polarizing views usually created with everything, whether it's environment storytelling, it's just generally about all the issues that we're facing at large in India and globally. It's that initiation of dialogue and the willingness to initiate that dialogue, fully well knowing that it may be an opposing point of view. So thank you.
Yeah,
That was
and
very
don't be afraid to be a little uncomfortable, because conversations that make change are uncomfortable. It's not going to be an easy conversation. Think of it as like you're talking to your parents about something that they just don't see eye to eye on, and those dinner conversations can be very ugly. We all know that, when there's like a fundamental thing, very tense, nobody's eating, everybody's looking at each other. Same way, you have to treat your editor the same way. Like you have to have those conversations, but you can do it in a way that's not very aggressive. I think they will respect you as a reporter if you back your statements with a good enough case, and that's worked for me.
Thank you for that. Let's move on to the next question, and it's by Aditi Prem Kumar. Please comment on the perception of local communities in conservationist studies as cultural subjects, as opposed to political ones, and their resistance against incompetence of state mechanisms. Loaded question.
Yeah, and I think this has a lot of moving parts. I tried addressing them in my slides, but I could do a whole different deck on tribal communities. I think she's right in a way that they are portrayed in a very singular lens when we talk about conservation spaces, in the way they are photographed or whether they're talked about. And we need to change that because, of course, they are the communities where the superstructures are exercising their influence, their social and psychological control on these vulnerable communities. But there is resistance on the ground. We just need to be able to cover it. And I missed it. I clearly missed building that tension in my manga-based stories. I did the story about how, hey, they are saving these great seeds, these old strains of millets, and you hike all the way up to Niamgiri, or you travel all the way up, and you somehow it gets out of the story, or your editor takes it out, or you forget to put so much emphasis, is the tension. The fact that there is resistance to the state's one note idea of development. It cannot be a one solution fit all situation. You cannot say, I can tell you for the Dongri Akon story, for instance, the state said, we need to build the roads because it will be for medical purposes, medical emergencies, because they're so remote. The hamlets of the Dongri Akons are very remote. And their purpose is that if you don't build these roads, then you cannot get a pregnant lady downhill, or if there is any complication. But the tribe said, we are not against the roads, but we don't want 30 feet wide roads because that will cause rampant deforestation. And you have to talk about that tension. You have to talk about that resistance when it comes to tribal communities. Try to cover all notes because, again, they are not props in your story. Then this is something I'm still working on today. I'm so nervous. I can confess to everybody. When I do a story that has an Adivasi community in the center, I'm very nervous. I'm very nervous because I always have this at the back of my head that I'm going to mess up, or I might falter at some point. My gaze or my writing may become a little exploitative. So you have to constantly check yourself, and you have to talk about their political resistance. You have to talk about the fact that not all tribal communities are uniform. There is resistance within the community. There can be one part that's pro-development. There can be one part that's against development. So you have to capture all that dynamics. You just can't portray them as this one singular organism because that's not what they are. And they need that representation. Diane, can you hear me? Hello? Diane?
Hi, Sonali, I think we faced a bit of an internet issue. I don't know on whose part it was, but I think we're back on right now.
Yes, but we should thank the internet gods that it didn't happen during the talk. We were praying.
Yes,
I don't know what happened.
I'm glad the frame is the way it is, because then the rest of the audience, all the fingers and toes that have been completely crossed out, because our lecture went off smooth, and this hiccup, I'll take it. But yeah, but I think on that note, I think we'll move on to our next question. Chawla, how do you gain the trust of environmental organizations to access, especially what you're starting to get access, especially when you're starting off? And if I'm not mistaken, he's talking about more from photography, from a photographic work point of view. I think we got this question in from Instagram.
I think that's a very interesting question, Harshit. Thank you for that. And what you need to do if you're looking to work with a specific environmental organization or a community is do your pre-reporting, your research. Don't take your camera the first time you go see them. Spend some time with them just by being there and make a case for yourself. And that's very important. You really need to build up to the time when your notebook comes out or your camera comes out. You cannot parachute in. So if you say you're looking for a community in Himachal Pradesh and you're sitting in Delhi, write the emails, have a few phone calls, have a WebEx call if it works, and then when you go to the community or when you go to their offices, don't show your camera or don't show your notebook. Like, come with all kinds of transparency, but at the same time, you shouldn't ambush them. There has to be an ease from both ends when you're doing these stories. So the more time you give into your, the preparation, the pre-reporting, the easier it will be for you to do the story. And I can tell you this because after the Dongria Kond, we stayed with them overnight when we were doing the story. And when I was leaving, one of the ladies, she made me a small case of all her indigenous seeds, and she gave it to me. And I knew at that point that that you have done enough to build a trust factor. And also at the point, I went in with someone who was with the community, so I was not like this person from nowhere. He must have talked about the fact that we were coming. We went there, we just chilled for a while, hung out, talked to them normally, and then started the process of reporting. So it has to be, it's like how you build any relationship or a friendship, right? You just don't go with the really intense questions first, like, what do you feel about God? You don't do that stuff. You build a very easy, casual equation, and then you come up with the hard questions or long questions. Yeah.
Sonali, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Sonali, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
You know what I
can
love?
hear you.
I love that all your bits of advice go straight home to all of us. Yeah. I think there's a bit of a lag, but we'll work with it.
Yeah, I can hear
But
you.
I love
can
how
hear you
all
fine.
your I love how all your advice goes back home. It's like talk to your editor the way you talk to your parents. When you're working with a community, start slow, like you're going into a relationship. I really love all of those little nuggets that you're throwing at us right now, actually.
Yeah, well,
so
it works for me.
you.
I have
I'm going to
I have
go
a
to
tough
our
set of
next
parents.
question. Sonali, can you hear me? I'm facing a bit of the internet issue up and down.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
All right. Okay. So I'm going to continue with our next question. Yes, I can right now. I think there's a bit of a lag, but we'll work with it. So our next one is by the man himself, Parmesh, who's the head of the lab. Um, how do we get our politicians to realize the impact of climate change? I can't help thinking that the US would be very different if Al Gore had won the election. And how do we get it on the mind of voters? Right now, only in some countries it matters, but in most countries, it is not top of the mind for voters as an issue.
Hi, Parmesh. Thank you for that question. One thing that I'd like to highlight, something that you should keep in mind, that even the politicians you think are talking about climate change or really harping on that issue again and again, and I'm not talking about Al Gore specifically, you have to really look at their policies to see what they're doing in terms of investment and and locally or even foreign investments. So the administration that was investing in the Sasan plan was giving them money was actually pretty pro climate change in the US. They were shutting down coal plants. So the whole idea of you have to be careful when you're talking about political leaders because they come with their different shades. Diane, can you hear me? You just disappeared for a while. Can you hear me? Okay, so basically that, and the other, so I'm going to come back to the point. I just got a green signal from the team. The other aspect is that, when you're looking at making this a voter issue, you have to first, if you're going to talk about India, we have to start with our own country. Where is climate change anywhere in our policies? It's nowhere to be found. You know, it's not even remotely a vote bank issue, and it is a hard job to create sensitivity, for voters, because nowadays populations are very polarized. You're either for a topic or against it, and there is no space for a dialogue. But I do believe that the more stories you do, the more investigations you do, and bring in the proof. So bring in the money, follow the money. The best way to convince an audience that there is something fishy is when you talk about the money behind a policy, or you talk about the money being invested in a certain situation. Once that happens, I think it's relatively easy to convince your voter base, because you can do a very personal, emotional piece, and that might work for a few days, to harness empathy, or our hearts may go out to an issue, but to have long-term impact, to have consolidated impact, hit where it hurts the most, and that's money. Go after the money, and that's something that I learned as an investigative reporter, and that's the first thing I see when I look at projects, when I look at presidencies, or leadership in India. Where are they spending their money on? What is the the under the table dealership happening? Look at, you go on a broader scale. If you're looking at an ice cutter going to the Arctic Circle, who's making that ice cutter? Who's paying for the manufacturing? This is one of my colleagues is working on that, and the other ways to bring to light this issue, but the voters will mostly respond if you tell them there's something wrong, there's wrong usage of their money. Because in India, there's so much of disparity, right? You can't go and tell someone, ki koila band kar do, stop coal, when people don't have electricity, do not have. We have to give them, the superstructures have to first come up with an alternate model. And then we have to make them realize that there is a lot of shoddy business happening when it comes to the capitalist attitude, that they are not going to benefit anyway, mostly. So, they have other opportunities to do so.
So well said. Absolutely, I completely agree. I think, Sonali, I'm going to take one last question. You can hear me, right, Sonali?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to take one last question to wrap up. Everyone else, thank you so much for all your comments. In case we haven't been able to answer your questions during this chat, we'll try our best to try and get Sonali to answer them offline. But to end this chat, I'm going to go with our last question. You've inspired a lot of people in our audience to take up journalism. So the last question is by someone called Kevin Nisar. Want to make a career as an investigative journalist? Can you give me some advice? Can I start working as a journalist as a student? I think that's a beautiful note to end on, that you're inspiring younger breed of journalists.
It's such a hopeful note as well, and I'm so glad if my talking about what's happening in the world and other works can inspire someone. So the first thing, you can be a journalist as a student. That's not an issue. I started off as the chief editor of a student paper when I was in college. That's when I started writing about stuff in Singapore. When we did blogs, we worked around really tight guidelines because it was Singapore. So you don't have media freedom as you would, understand it in other parts of the world. But that push and pull, that tension is something I understood while I was in college. So you can definitely start when you're a student or you're in a university or a college. And how do you make your career as an investigative journalist? First and foremost, you have to read the works of other investigative reporters. You have to understand their processes. It's like being a forensic scientist, right? How do you examine the DNA on a crime scene? There is like a protocol, like steps you take, 1, 2, 3, 4. Similarly, look at investigative reporters who are currently working on projects. And there are a couple of us who like take a year or 2 years to work on a particular issue. The Sasan piece was a team effort, and we worked for a year on that. And then we did another 1-year project on sea level rise and how Japan is trying to grow this island in the Philippine Sea. But because of strategic and military reasons, it just happens that if they're successful, atolls might benefit of it. So if you are an investigative reporter, look at the work of others who are in the field, and also subscribe to all those boring magazines that that you would never read otherwise, those trade journals, those finance magazines, because that is where you will get information, like a shipping magazine where there are just numbers and numbers of import and export. And that is where, my friend, you will find a lead in. You will find, so all those boring journals, if you have a beat that you're really looking into, say poaching, go for those really targeted publications that do not cover broad topics but a specific topic, and you'll find your area of interest, something to really dig deep into when you're covering such issues. I have subscribed to a lot of trade magazines, and that's where I get. I think Diane has lost connection. Is Pallavi there?
Yep, I'm here.
I think, yeah, Pallavi, I think you will have to pick up the mantle. I think Diane has dropped
That's
off.
cool. All right.
Hey.
Cool. That was so good. And I think that was our last question for the evening. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Our audiences are so thrilled, and we have so many more questions for you to answer. They're all looking forward to connecting with you. Also, before we leave this talk today, I'd just like to quickly take our audiences of what we have in store for them next. So, if you would remember, right before the lockdown of the pandemic hit, we were going to go ahead with an event called Mission Possible, talking about the breakthroughs of Indian women in STEM, and we had to cancel that. But we're back, and we're going to be back virtually. We're going to do this through the course of 3 weekends. So, the 17th, 24th, and 31st of July, please block your calendars for us. So you have Women in STEM, and we'll be back with that. If you would, we've pinned our COVID resources and donation fund link on our YouTube comment section. It would be wonderful if you could go ahead and support any one of these organizations. And we're so grateful to everyone who supported us till now. We're doing a YouTube live for the first time. So if you have any comments, any things that you would like us to improve on, please go ahead and tell us. We'd be grateful to hear from you. And go ahead and keep tabs on us as we tell you more about our upcoming event. And we just hope to see you all soon. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sonali.
Thank you so much for having me. Great job, guys.